Hey, my name is Lou, and I'm one of the pastors here at Community Church. We are back online again this week, and things are not totally back to normal yet, but we're getting there, so stay tuned. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Community Church. We are so glad that you are with us. My name is Tom. I'm one of the pastors here. If you have not already done so, check out communitychurch.net/connect. Fill out our form. Let us know that you joined us today. And just to say thank you for filling out that form, we're going to send you a gift card to a coffee shop. If you never had coffee, it's amazing. It's the only thing that keeps me going during this quarantine.
Hi, my name is Danielle. I just want to remind you that every week we have new programs for kids. Go to communitychurch.net/kids.
So a couple of weeks ago, we started something called Today's Big Idea. And every morning, if you sign up for it, every morning you'll get a little notification on your phone that will have some kind of verse and then something to think about. And I just found out this week that there are a lot of people that don't know you can actually click on the notification. Right, Tom?
Yes, that is true, Lewis.
Yeah. You can click on it, and then there's more to it. So if you haven't been doing that, there's more for you to see. And if you want to sign up for that, you can download the Community Church app and then go to notifications, enable Today's Big Idea in the little side menu, and that will appear on your phone every morning.
I can't. So it's been about 16 weeks that we've been holding our church services entirely online. Now, while we haven't been able to gather in person, that hasn't stopped us from making a difference as a church in the town and the area of Babylon. And we can't wait to tell you about what those things are in the coming weeks. But the truth is, all that we have done is only made possible by those who partner with us financially. Now, if Community Church is not your home church, we don't want you to feel any obligation, any pressure to give. So, if you'd like to partner with us, please go to communitychurch.net/give, or you can even use the give function on the app.
So a lot of people have been asking about what our plans look like to reopen as we get closer to the day when we're going to be back together in person. That's cool. It's exciting. We can't wait. Trust me, I'm very anxious to get back together again in person. The good news is that there will be a day that we meet back here in person like we used to. The bad news is we don't know when that day is yet. We're doing as much research as we can. We're trying to come up with the best plan that we can. But as of right now, the guidelines that have been put in place really don't allow us to do anything that even closely resembles what we were doing before the pandemic. It's almost impossible for us to run a kids program like we normally would. And when they're singing, our little radius goes from 6 feet to 12 feet, which severely limits the amount of people that we can have in our building. And so there are all these things that make things really tough. Our hallways are also really small, so the whole idea of appropriate traffic flow makes things tough. So when we do meet, we want to make sure that one, we're being safe, two, we're respecting the guidelines that have been put in place by our authorities, and three, we want to make sure that it's something that's true to who we are as a church. And so stay tuned, we're working on stuff. We also have another plan in the works for something a little bit different that we think is going to be a lot of fun. But that hasn't been finalized yet. So stay tuned, stay in the loop. If you're not on our little newsletter, make sure you go over to communitychurch.net/connect so you can get on our list, and we'll keep you up to date with everything that's going on.
Thanks for being part of our online service today. You're about to hear a song and the next part of our sermon series called Being Right. Thank you. Have a great day. No, I'm not going to sing that. Peace out.
In the darkness we were waiting, without hope and without light, till from heaven you came running. There was mercy in your eyes, to fulfill the law and prophets. To a virgin came the word, from a throne of endless glory, to a cradle in the dirt. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit. to reveal the kingdom coming and to reconcile the lost, to redeem the whole creation. You did not despise the cross, for even in your suffering you saw to the other side. Knowing this was our salvation, Jesus, for our sake you died. Praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. And the morning that you rose, all of heaven held its breath, till that stone was moved for good, for the Lamb had conquered death. And the dead rose from their tombs, and the angels stood in awe, for the souls of all who come to the Father are restored. And the church of Christ was born, but then the Spirit lit the flame. Now His gospel truth of all shall not kneel, shall not faint. By His blood and in His name, in His freedom I am free. For the love of Jesus Christ, who has resurrected me. Oh, praise the Father, praise the Son, praise the Spirit, three in one. God of glory, majesty, praise forever to the King of Kings. Praise forever to the King of Kings.
So this week we are back in what has become affectionately known as the Dark Gray Dungeon. But that's okay, because hopefully we're not going to be here for too much longer. We're also in part 2 of a series called Being Right. And the most important principle for today to keep in mind from last week is that within us, there is this desire. You can say it's an instinctual, natural desire. There's this desire to feel right. Now, I'm not just talking about in arguments, in conflicts, but even in general, to know that overall there is a standard and I am meeting that standard. It's important to us that we feel like we're meeting the standard, we're measuring up, we're doing enough, we're cutting the mustard. We want to do what's right, what's acceptable. Now, even if you're somebody who's like, no, I don't do what's right, and I'm proud of it, my little friend group, we don't do what's right, I belong to this group or that group or whatever, and we pride ourselves on not doing what other people think is right. Even within groups like that, there is an acceptable standard. And maybe you don't call it what's right, but there is a standard that is considered right behavior, and the members of that group all want to live up to that standard. It's part of who we are. We were made that way. We were made to feel like we're right. Now, what we said last week was that in our culture, and even in the church, especially in the church maybe, we get ourselves in trouble because we prioritize being right about issues over being right with people. And the reason why this is such an issue in the church is because Jesus had something pretty powerful to say about this whole thing. He kind of painted a picture of ritualistic sacrifice. That was a thing back then to Jesus's people, those Jewish people. That was a really big deal. People do it like 2 or 3 times a year. They would go offer a sacrifice in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, which to them, offering a sacrifice in Jerusalem was like the holiest thing in the holiest place. It was a really big deal. So sometimes you'd have to take a trip that was several days long, and you would bring something that cost you a lot, and you would go offer it there. So you're spending a lot of time, a lot of not literally money, but a lot of stuff that's valuable to you. And Jesus says, if you go through all that and you're about to do it, you're about to offer that sacrifice as an act of worship, he says, but you remember that you're not right with somebody, that there's something in between you and somebody else. He says, leave it there. Go and be reconciled to them. Go make it right with them, which that would have been impractical. It would have been countercultural. He would have shocked people by that story. And so in the church, we have to be really, really careful about how and when we take a stand with issues, when we care about being right with issues. Because if we're going to be people who follow Jesus, we need to be right with people. We need to prioritize being right with people at the very least, like as much as we prioritize being right about issues. So that was last week. Now here we go into this week. Here's what I want you to think about, right? I want you to think about the last time you got into an argument or a conflict, the last time there was an issue. Maybe it was with your neighbor, maybe it was with your parent, maybe it was with your teenager, maybe it was with your spouse or your in-laws or whoever, okay? There was an argument, all right? Now, if you take the total fault, the level of fault in that argument, what percentage of it would you say was yours? I don't know, this might be like kind of hard for you to remember, because if you're like me, your last argument was like many, like minutes ago, right? But maybe you can think of an issue that you had, and probably most of the time, if we're being real, most of the time, I'm arguing because I believe I'm more right than the other side. I would rarely say, no, I am absolutely faultless, blameless in this issue. I am 100% right. So if there's a percentage, maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 40%. If there's a percentage that is mine and I can control it, I can handle that percentage. If it's 10% and I have the power to handle that 10%, why don't I just take that right away? Why don't I make that step one, right? It's logical. If we're working toward resolution, why wouldn't I take the low-hanging fruit that's right in front of me, the part of it that I can control? It seems logical, but it's not so easy to do. And you know this, right? If you've ever gotten into an argument, it's not easy to own your slice of the pie. It's even more obvious when you see it in someone else, right? Maybe you see 2 people fighting. Maybe it's 2 people in your family. You see them fighting, and you're looking at one, and you're like, just admit you shouldn't have said that. And then you'll be able to work toward, right? Just own, even if you just own that small slice of the pie, you'll be able to make some progress. And we see it, and we witness it, and it is so painfully obvious to the people that are watching, but it's like that person just can't do it. They can't do it. And sometimes, if we're honest, we can't do it. We don't want to do it. So the question is, what is that thing? It's almost like there's something that's stopping us from doing that. There's something that's polluting our ability to see the situation logically. What is that? And what do we do about it? How do we handle it? Now, what a lot of people would say is that it's pride. It's pride that stops us from admitting that we're wrong. And I definitely think that there's some truth to that. But if we go one layer deeper, like beneath the pride, maybe even what's causing the pride, I think we'll see that what's actually driving that, what's actually polluting the situation, is something that we call shame. Shame. Now, shame is a really, really big thing. It's a big thing. I think all of us struggle with it to some degree or another. Sometimes it's hard to detect. It's hard to figure out when shame is causing us to act a certain way, because it's one of those things that manifests itself in other ways. We talked about shame when we first launched as a church. I think it was on week 3. And it's every time we talk about it, it's a really, really powerful thing because it so often goes unaddressed, but it is extremely, extremely toxic to our relationships and to our own lives. And when it comes to being right, we have to start with shame. The reason why is because shame is the feeling of not being right. Right? Shame is the feeling like there is a standard and I don't measure up. I don't cut the mustard. On week 3, when we first talked about this, I mentioned somebody, her name was Brene Brown. Her name actually still is Brene Brown. She's a researcher. She studies shame. That's like her entire career. And she says that shame is the intensely painful experience of believing that we're flawed, that we don't measure up, and therefore unworthy of love and acceptance, or unworthy of love and belonging. And so we're afraid of it because it's painful. In fact, researchers have also found that our brain registers experiences of shame the same way that we register experiences of physical pain. So in the same way that we flinch, right, when we think we're about to experience physical pain, a lot of times we'll flinch in conflict because we feel like we're about to experience shame. And so it has this power, this ability to totally corrupt a situation. And maybe you've experienced this, right? Like maybe you've gone into a conflict genuinely with a pure intention. Like, okay, we just need to address this and then we can move on and everything will be fine. But as soon as you bring it up, the other side starts throwing some blame at you, like, well, you did this and you did this. And all of a sudden that blame starts to set in as feelings of shame, like an attack on the identity that I, as a person, I do not measure up. I do not cut the mustard. And all of a sudden the intention of that conflict shifts from going toward it to genuinely resolve and fix, help even the relationship, to now fighting to be right. Why? Because we're flinching. We're trying to avoid the feeling of shame because shame is something it's intensely painful, but we rarely name it as shame. We might say, oh, he's just getting defensive, or he doesn't want to admit that he's wrong, or he has an issue with pride. But really what it comes down to is, no, I don't want to have to experience the fact that right now I feel like I don't measure up, like I'm falling short. And so we have to deal with shame because it totally corrupts our ability to see things accurately. It's what stops us from owning our slice of the pie. It's what keeps us arguing even after we've realized, okay, maybe we're not as right as we thought we were. And ultimately, it's what starts to shred, damage our relationships. It prevents us from being open to the fact that we might actually be wrong, and ultimately prevents us from reaching some kind of resolution. And so what we might say is that being right with people requires us to first be right with ourselves, to be right internally, to deal with shame. Now, normally in a message, we'll have a big idea, something that we work towards, make a big deal, put it on the screen, right? We might say that was the small idea, okay? That's step 1 toward the big idea. And here's a little disclaimer for you, right? So if you're not somebody who considers themselves a church person, or you're like, no, I don't want to hear anything about God, I'm not into that, fine. Well, that's kind of the end of the road when it comes to what I can do for you in the world of shame. Just acknowledge that when there's some kind of conflict, right, and we're not seeing it logically, probably the issue there is that we're not right internally. There's some kind of shame that's preventing us from acknowledging the fact that there's some fault on our side. So that's kind of the big idea. But there's big idea for you, small idea in general though, okay? But if you are somebody who follows Jesus, or if you're at least open to the fact that he might be onto something, at least in a few areas, it seems like he knows what he's talking about. There is something powerful that Jesus did that speaks to this issue of shame within us, and ultimately, as it pertains to how we relate to people, being right with people. And the Apostle Paul writes about it in the letter that he wrote to the church in Rome. I want to look at that passage. It's a little bit clunky. There's some words there that we kind of have to dissect a little bit. But if you'll hang with me, I think you'll see that there's something pretty powerful here that Paul is talking about. So we're in Romans chapter 3, starting in verse 20. Here's what he says. He's explaining how Christianity works, right? He's explaining like the ins and outs of it, right? And he says, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Saying, okay, so you have like righteous. If you understand the word righteous as measuring up, right? No one will measure up in God's sight by the works of the law, meaning God sees everything, right? If there's anybody who knows every good, bad thing about you, everything you've ever done wrong, like God could see it all. And so if we're talking about being right by simply like working to do the good and not the bad, like the works of the law, Paul's like, okay, let's be real here. In God's sight, God knows everybody has issues, right? Everybody's imperfect. So he says no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. He says rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. Sin means to fall short, our shortcomings, not meeting the standard. He says really what the law does is it shows us where we go wrong. Paul says in some other letter, he says, actually it's later on this letter, he says, okay, so let's say the law says don't envy. Well, because I have a problem with envy, the fact that the law says that shows me where I fall short, right? He's saying that here. Then he says something that would have like shocked everybody who's listening. He says, but now, apart from the law, the righteousness, the standard of God has been made known, which wouldn't make sense to people at first. He says, to which the law and the prophets testify. I mean, people have been talking about this for a long time. They've been talking about how it was coming. He says, this righteousness is given. Again, that's like a paradox. Righteousness is not something that's given. Righteousness is something that you work for, you work to meet the standard of righteousness. But he says, no, this is not something you work for. This is something that's given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. He says, there's no difference between Jew and Gentile, basically Jewish person and everybody else. He says, for all have sinned, have fallen short, and fall short of the glory of God, fall short of that standard. He says, and this is the part that's like mind-blowing, countercultural, revolutionary, probably wouldn't make sense to people who are initially hearing it for the first time. He says, and all are justified, made right, like declared, you are good enough. You have met the standard. They are made right, not by working, but freely by his grace, like a gift, through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus, because Jesus purchased that right standing for us when he died, like through the redemption that came through Jesus. He later says it's to be received by faith. Now, this is something that would be really countercultural. It's picture this idea of being in God's sight. Okay, if there's anybody who knows the good, the bad, and the ugly about you, like God, he sees everything, and God could pick and point and be like, you are bad for this reason, that reason. And I'm sure we'd all be humiliated if God showed the world every horrible thing that goes on within us. But what he says is like, instead of working to try and like do the right things and not say this and say that and try to break this habit, instead of like being perfect and trying to work to that really impossible standard of righteousness, in God's sight, like what Jesus did was buy that for you. So here's where we connect the dots. And maybe this is kind of hard to follow along with, but just like hang with me here. Here's where we connect the dots, right? If we have this desire to be right, like if that's natural, instinctual within us, and shame is what makes us feel like we are not right. By Jesus, because of Jesus, God makes us right. Like in his sight, he is like, you are good with me. And so shame is falling short and feeling like you are unworthy of love, acceptance, and belonging. What Jesus is saying, what we call justification, is Jesus saying, no, you have been made right. And in spite of the fact that you've fallen short, you are still loved, accepted, and you belong. And so if that's true, think about this. If that's true, if we are loved and we're accepted by God who sees everything in spite of our failures, then it totally disarms shame, because we don't feel that need, that pull to have to prove that we're right. We don't have to run from the feeling of being wrong, because we don't have to fear shame. We say Jesus died to save us from our sins, right? Sins are being the things that, like, where we fall short. Shame is the feeling that accompanies the action of sin, right? Sin is falling short. Shame is the feeling of falling short. And Jesus, in dying on the cross for us, he showed us his unconditional, in spite of our failures, over the top, crazy, radical, countercultural love, illogical love. And that disarms shame, because we no longer have something to prove. And so we might say our big idea for today, right? Being right with God gives me the freedom to be real about what's wrong with me, because I'm not afraid of it, because my faults don't bring along with them, or don't have to bring along with them, that feeling of shame. I don't have to be afraid of being wrong. And so here's what that looks like, right? If I go home and let's say I need to talk to my wife about something, right? And she says, hey, I don't like the way that you addressed our kids, or the way that you spoke to me, or she points out something that I did, right? If I am subject to shame, all of a sudden those words are going to start to make me question my identity, and I'm going to start to feel lower and smaller, like I am a failure, like what kind of dad am I? Like I'm never going to measure up or meet the standard. But if I am right, like on the deepest level with God, who knows me inside and outside, and I know I am loved and cared for, and I'm accepted, and I have a place to belong because of what he's done, not because of what I've done, right? Then now she could say, look, I don't like that. I don't like that you did that. I don't like that you did this. And I don't need to get defensive. I don't need to prove myself. I can be free. Like, yeah, you know what? What just happened there, that was not a thing that I want to happen. And so I'm going to own that. I'm going to fix it. And then we will be made right. I'll be made right with her because I don't get defensive and we don't fight about it. And I'll be made right with my kids because I'll be fixing whatever I did with them. It gives us the freedom to be real about what's wrong with us. Not only in the home, but this also applies to cultural issues. A lot of the times what ends up happening is we pick a side. We've spoken about this before. We pick a side when it comes to like these hot topics in our culture. And we decide like that's the right side. And now I've got to defend that. I've got to put my flag in the ground. Why? Because I've already decided like they're wrong and I don't want to be wrong, because I don't want to be the person that's on the wrong end of major issues like this. And so I've got to fight and I'm not going to listen. And so really the side, like all that happens is both sides just keep screaming louder and we get further and further away from actually coming to a conclusion. And here's what makes shame so dangerous. When we're unwilling to be wrong, there's no hope of actually getting to a solution. Usually things are not so clear. Usually there's not a clear right and a clear wrong. Usually the answer is somewhere in the messy middle. And if we're harboring shame within us, we're not going to be willing to admit those areas where we're wrong. And ultimately, we're not going to be able to arrive at the solution, at the answer, because we've stuck our flag in the ground and we've decided that we're not moving, and we are trying to avoid those intensely painful experiences, those experiences of shame. Maybe this is what you need to take home with you, right? My level of difficulty admitting that I'm wrong is directly related to the level of shame that I'm harboring within me. And I believe, like, if that's true, then I believe that my ability to thrive in relationships, in conflicts, in addressing issues that our society is going through, my ability to thrive is directly related to my willingness to admit that I may be wrong. I may not be able to see the whole issue. I may be fighting from a place where I've got incomplete information. We need to be willing to admit that we're wrong. And if you look at the church as a whole, I think that if all you have to do is look back maybe the last 10 years, and what you'll see is that more and more culture is starting to disagree with the church. More and more and more and more on issues. On issues we're disagreeing. And so what's happening is in a lot of places, the church is now choosing to be right about issues over being right with people. We're prioritizing that, and we're getting this divide, this separation. Now, most of the world doesn't trust the church. Why? Because we are on totally different sides, and that we're right, they're right. And I think the church's ability to thrive, the church's ability to be right with people is going to depend on the church's willingness to address the fact that there may be some issues, some social, cultural issues that maybe we're not right about, or at least be willing to be open to conversations. But instead, we have stuck our flag in the ground, and we just create distance. And even in those places where we are right and we disagree, so much could be said about the level of shame that we're carrying in the way that we disagree with one another. Can we disagree with one another and be like, you know what, this is what I believe, this is what you believe, but we can still be right because Jesus told me to prioritize that over this issue? Our ability to thrive individually and as a whole is going to rest on our ability to handle our shame. And so through all of that, ironically, what we need to be reminded of is the fact that we have been made right with God. It's being right with God that will give us the freedom to address what's wrong within us. Okay, I had to take a break because I can't have the air conditioning running while I'm recording, and so I sweat because it gets about 1,000,000 degrees in here, and I had to wipe the sweat. Now, if you're a follower of Jesus, you know this already, but if you're not, there's good news. The good news is that you are offered this ability to be right with God as a free gift. It wasn't free to Jesus. He bought it. He paid for it. But because of what he's done, we can be seen in God's sight as completely right, knowing we don't have to work to earn something, to earn some prize for God, but we can rest in the fact that he sees us as his children. And all you need to do is talk to him about it. To get alone at some point, maybe in the bathroom, right? Maybe it's at night before you go to bed, and just talk to him. Let him know you're aware that you can't work to make yourself feel right. You will never be able to do enough good to live up to some perfect standard. And that you accept his free gift of love, of grace. And that's the first important step in a relationship with him. And from there, you can talk to him whenever you want to. Throw your worries on him. He says, cast your cares on him. You don't have to work. You don't have to. It doesn't mean, some people think okay, if I want to have a relationship with God, well, now I've got to get all the rules right and get everything wrong. No, by definition, the people who follow Jesus are people that know they don't have it all together and need Jesus to help them. That's basically our statement of faith, right? So I believe it's the best decision you can make, to tell God you want to have a relationship with him, to be made right in his sight. And not only are your sins paid for, but your feelings of shame can be taken care of. It takes work. It's not something that's just gone in a second, but you can know, okay, though I have fallen short, I don't have to feel like I am unworthy of love and acceptance because I am unconditionally loved and accepted by God. So here's my challenge for you this week when it comes to being right with people. The next time you're in a conversation or conflict, argument, either in person or online, maybe if you're tempted to post something that you know is going to be argumentative, I want you to stop. I want you to ask. If you are working toward resolution, if you are working toward being right with people. Or if you are trying to prove that you are right about an issue. One way is so much better than the other. And I think that it's time that we stop settling for less. Thanks for hanging out with us this week. Hope to see you next week.
Hi, my name is Joanne. I run the guest services and community outreach department here at Community Church. I am so grateful that you chose to spend some time with us this Sunday. As a reminder, if you get a chance, please go to communitychurch.net/connect. We'd love to know that you were with us today. Have a wonderful week.